All right, hey folks, we are going to dig into the world of instruments today, and we're going to start with a very specific instrument family called the woodwinds. So, just a little bit of background here, real fast. An instrument family is going to refer to any group of instruments that are similar. Now, obviously, they may not be exactly the same because, think about your own family. Are any of you in your family exactly the same? I can speak for me, and I can tell you that me and my siblings are not exactly the same. We are similar, but not exact. So that's exactly what a family of instruments is. It is a grouping of instruments that are similar, that are like one another, but have some minor differences. So getting into the woodwind family right here, we're going to start with this family of instruments. So let's dig in. So an overview. The term woodwind is going to refer to any instrument that uses a reed to create the sound. Now, a reed can either be single or double reed instruments. So, a reed is a piece of cane that has been carved down and shaped and molded into what you see on your screen here. Now, the single reed is going to be these right here. Where you are talking about like the soprano saxophone, the B-flat clarinet, alto saxophone, things like that. A single reed means that there is just one piece of cane that has been shaped down so it is thinner at the tip and thicker back towards the end. What that does is it allows the reed to be attached to a mouthpiece using a piece of metal called a ligature. The ligature is going to hold that reed on the mouthpiece, allowing just the tip of it to vibrate, which is going to be what produces the characteristic sound of a woodwind instrument. A double reed is exactly what it sounds like. It is two pieces of cane that have been folded around a small metal tube called a ferrule or a staple. And what they do is then it gets wrapped around kind of like you see over on the left side, or the right side, of your screen right here. And what they do is they wrap around pieces of string to hold the bottom of that reed together. When they hold that together, the tip is allowed to vibrate against one another, which is what produces the characteristic double reed sound that you are going to hear in a few minutes here. So both of these instruments, because they are made, both of these reed types, because they are made of a plant, cane is a type of plant, they do need to make sure that they are soaked before they work. So if you are thinking about playing a double reed instrument at some point or another, just keep that in mind. It's something that has to have moisture in it for it to work the right way. So we're going to look at the first single reed instrument rather is the flute. So the flute is unique because the flute does not have an actual reed. What is used is something called an air reed. So what happens is the hole that's on the flute right there is called the tone hole. And what you do is you blow across the tone hole, kind of like if you were to take a pop bottle, like a glass pop bottle, and you blow across that, you're going to get that toot kind of noise if you were to blow across the bottom. This is exactly what an air reed is. It is creating a vibration of air by splitting the air. Part of it goes into the flute, part of it goes out and over the tone hole. The other really interesting part about the flute is that it's not made of wood. It's made of metal. So what that does is it gives it its very characteristic sound. So we're going to listen to a little bit of this instrument right here. It's a flute. It's going to be the Mozart Flute Concerto, and we're going to hear what the flute sounds like. There it goes. So the flute has a really unique sound to it. It has a little bit of that kind of metallic sort of sound, while at the same time it still has a warm kind of round tone. So the flute is an instrument that can play a lot of really, really high notes and is typically known for that. But as you heard in that recording, it can also play some lower pitches as well. So it does have a reasonably wide range. Moving on here, we're going to take a look at the variations that exist on the flute. Now, this is just kind of a fun fact sort of slide right here. So there are many different flute types that exist. So the big one that you see at the top right there is the curved one. It's called a bass flute, and that plays some very low notes that we don't normally associate with the flute. However, it exists, so I wanted to kind of show it to you and give you an awareness of what that instrument is. The next flute down is something called an alto flute. So it is a little bit higher than the bass flute, but still lower than the standard flute that we see in bands. The next two flutes are your standard C concert flutes. So there's a little bit of a difference. One of them has what's called a C foot and one of them has a B foot. It means that there's one that can play one extra note. But either way, they're almost identical. They are basically the exact same thing that you would see in band. If you have a sibling who plays in band or you've ever gone to see one of the band concerts over at MMS or Parkland or wherever, you've most likely seen this concert flute. The next one is a solo instrument. It's called an E-flat flute. It plays in a little bit of a different key. It's a little bit higher because it's a little bit shorter. And as we learned before, the shorter the instrument, the higher the sound. The last one is something called the piccolo, and the piccolo is another type of flute. It is very short, and therefore it plays a very high sound. And this is used for a lot of different applications. Usually it's used to sit on top of everything else and just kind of float above that sound and give it this nice high, sometimes referred to as a descant sort of sound. So this right here is a flute ensemble. We'll take a listen to what that sounds like. So as you were listening there, and you can feel free to rewind this and listen to it one more time here, folks, you should have heard the standard flute there starting in the beginning. As it goes a little bit in, the lower flute noises sounds start to come in. So you've got that bass and that alto flute starting kind of around the same time, a handful of measures in. Now that really long sustained, like I said, descant note, that is the piccolo right there, playing those really high sustained pitches, giving us this really wide range of sound. But they all sound similar because they are all part of that flute category. And what that does is it gives you this very blended sort of sound. And when you have all those instruments that are reasonably the same, they work really, really well together. So that's kind of the flute ensemble right there, folks. Next up, we have the first actual reed instrument, aside from the flute. It is the clarinet. So it's a long, straight tube that produces sound using a reed. So unlike the flute, the reed is actually made of that cane, that wood, that attaches to the mouthpiece of the clarinet. So of the woodwind instruments, the clarinet actually has the largest range. It can go to some very low notes, and it can pop up to some really, really high ones up there as well. So what we're going to hear is a little bit of a clarinet kind of solo, a little bit of a cadenza here, where this performer is going to be playing all around with the range of the instrument. You're going to notice that it has a nice warm sound to it, that it does sound a little bit more wooden than the flute does. The flute sounds metallic, whereas the clarinet is going to sound a little bit more wooden. So now I did choose to pick one for clarinet that is a little bit on the faster side. Now, that doesn't mean that it can't play slow. I just happened to choose this one because he does use a humongous range of that instrument, all the way from those really low notes to those really, really high ones as well. So just be aware of that, that all of these instruments, yes, they might play fast sometimes, but just like any other instrument or voice, they can go slow as well. So hopefully you heard a little bit more of that kind of wooden sort of sound in that clarinet. And we're going to move on to the next type of instrument right here, which is called the oboe. So the oboe is our first double reed instrument. So the oboe has a very nasally sound. It's very much like if you plug your nose and talk, you get this kind of nasal sound. It almost sounds a little bit like when SpongeBob makes fun of Squidward. So a little bit of a pop culture reference there for you. So in the low register, it does have this nasally sort of sound. In the high register, it gets really smooth and really flowy. So this is an instrument that has different what we call timbres or sounds depending on the range of the instrument. So a little fun fact, the instrument that tunes the orchestra is the oboe. So at the very beginning, if you've ever gone to see an orchestra concert, you're going to hear the oboe start with this nice concert A, and they're all going to tune to that oboe. There is something called the English horn that exists, which is a larger version of the oboe, but that's just kind of a fun fact to keep in the back of your head. So we're going to listen to an oboe cadenza this time, where this performer is going to go ahead and play a little bit of that oboe for you so you can hear what that sounds like. So you can hear that control that that player has in there, where they get really quiet towards the end. That's something that's really cool about various different instruments. When you practice, you can get that kind of control. Now, as you were listening, hopefully you heard some of those lower notes get a little bit more of that kind of nasal sound, and those higher notes flow and be a little bit on the smoother side. So the next instrument we're going to look at is probably one of my favorite instruments. It's very challenging to play, but it is a really, really neat instrument. So this is called the bassoon. And the bassoon is probably one of the most complicated instruments in the band or orchestra. In total, it has 13 thumb keys, which means that your two thumbs right here, operate a total of 13 keys. Now, if you look here, let me see if I can do this right here, this pointer. If you look right here, you can see that we've got some thumb keys right up here at the top. Actually, excuse me, this is the bottom of the bottom joint here. So there are a few keys down there. The top joint has all of these right up here that you have to play operating with your thumb. So there's only 4 down here on your right-hand thumb. So that means that the remaining keys right up here are all operated by your left thumb. Now, clearly not at the same time, but there are different combinations that you need to be able to push. So like I said, one of the most complicated instruments, but it has a really, really awesome sound, which we're going to hear right now. So as you can hear, it sounds very similar to that oboe, except much deeper. It is a lower pitched instrument. It has this kind of nice, big, full, bassy sort of sound. So moving on here is the last instrument that we're going to talk about today is the saxophone. So the saxophone is one of the newer instruments in the ensemble. It was created around the year 1840. That's about when it was copywritten and mass produced and patented and things like that. So it is a recent invention and means it's not in very many orchestra pieces. Now, they do have orchestra pieces that they've written since the 1840s that include saxophone, but all the really old stuff that we usually study is without the saxophone because it was not invented until later on. So what you're going to hear now is an alto saxophone. So that's the one that you see right here. It's the most common one that you're going to see in the band. So we're going to hear what the alto saxophone sounds like in its own little cadenza all by itself. So let's take a listen. So now the saxophone is another instrument that has a pretty wide range. It can hit some pretty low notes down below that treble clef staff, but it can also go to several ledger lines up above the staff too. So all the woodwind instruments, when you learn how to play them and you've been playing them for years, have a very large range that you can use during your playing. So it's a really unique instrument that is made of metal, but still falls into the woodwind category because it does have that reed in there. So very unique instrument, very interesting, very cool sound. So the last one we're going to take a look at here are the variations on the saxophone. The three most common ones are going to be the tenor saxophone here on your left-hand side, the soprano saxophone here in the middle, and the baritone saxophone there at the very end. I'm going to leave you with a saxophone quartet, which is 4 saxophone players playing. You're going to hear all of those from the different saxophone variations. So starting out, you're going to hear the soprano saxophone, then the alto saxophone is going to enter, then the tenor, then the baritone. So it's going to go from high-pitched to low-pitched. Let's take a quick listen here. So because the saxophone was invented, all of these saxophones were essentially invented at the exact same time. So very much like the flute, they all look very similar. They all sound very similar. So they work really, really well together. So hopefully you could hear the difference in those saxophone sounds and kind of compare that sound to the other woodwind instruments we have. So that's your overview of those woodwind instruments. We're going to move on to our next activity here, folks. So thank you, and let's move on to the next part of our lesson.